Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. This is your Thursday AMA Premium video. Hopefully enjoy the content. We're just going to go through some of the questions that you guys have. So the first question, this is money making channel, but this big picture plan on how to make money. So my thought is just figure out assets you like, DCA them according to the risk levels that you're comfortable with. For the S&P, it would mean DCAing for me up to like 0.75 risk, for Bitcoin 0.4, for alts. It's based on some of the risk levels, but also just Bitcoin dominance. I try to outline different paths and whatnot, and I'll tell you, historically, I've definitely given some good trades at various points in the cycle. Let's keep going. What makes ETH an oscillator? What if it's a bleeder? It could be. It could be. It's not like it can't be. It's just that so far it has seen a series of higher lows, generally speaking, and lower highs. And so the question is, if it is a bleeder, it still could, come down here first and then go back up and then eventually go back down, right? Like it could always do something like that, but it's possible. I don't know. I honestly don't. I think this cycle, as I said, I think 0.03 to 0.04 is the bottom, but I could be wrong. PayPal had a nice run. Seems like a bullish flag being formed on the daily. Once this monetary policy arrives, it should benefit e-commerce. Thoughts? Yeah, so that was one. I in terms of making money, right? If you followed the PayPal, and we outlined this one fairly well, I think. Waiting for it to break out and then saying, all right, it's going to back test this wedge and then it's going to bounce. And it did, right? It bounced from the mid 50s and now it's, almost in the mid 70s. Now, I could see it, continuing to go up for a little bit. But I do think that upon yield curve on inversion, you might see it come back down. Okay. But one of the reasons why dominance of, like, say, the blue chips tops out before, things really start to collapse is because when things collapse, it's because only a few stocks are making it collapse in general, right? The Magnificent Seven can turn into the Terrible Seven, right? Where the large, like today, right? Like NVIDIA is down 6%, even though the S&P was flat. So, there were plenty of companies that did well today, but because NVIDIA was down 6%, the S&P was flat. Apple, I think did pretty well today. At least, yeah, at one point it was up 1.5%. So, yeah. You could see something like this play out for PayPal where, like, it sort of grinds higher and then, it comes back down and then does something like that, right? I could see something like that happening. And when that kind of stuff, and it doesn't have to be a lower low, right? It could be a higher low. When that stuff happens, that's why the smaller caps don't get hit as hard as the larger caps. Well, because they already got decimated, right? But yeah, those are my views. Where do I see total market cap in a year? I don't know. I think it could very well be lower in 6 months, or let's say 3 to 4 months. But in a year, hopefully it's bouncing back up. I don't know exactly. Like, I don't. It's just, it's so many things could happen between now and then. Like I'd just be throwing out a number. Do I look at fundamentals? If so, why do you never talk about it? I do. I have some videos on the channel where I talk about it. For instance, Ethereum, I think fundamentally is better than the altcoins that claim to want to flip it. And I've done whole videos on that. And I actually think Ethereum was actually quite a bit further ahead than a lot of the altcoins. And I think in terms of solving the blockchain trilemma, I think there's a lot of projects that claim to do it better, but usually they're sacrificing something. And so I just think Ethereum has been farther ahead. In terms of other fundamentals, I think the person running the project matters a lot. So I do like to bet on people, and that's one way to go about doing it. But at the end of the day, if the altcoin is just bleeding on its Bitcoin pair, then I don't spend a lot of time concerning myself with the fundamentals of that altcoin. I just assume they're bad if it just keeps on bleeding back to Bitcoin. What do I think about today's numbers on Q2 GDP? Yeah, no, it basically means that the economy has been doing fairly well. despite all the fears, right? But again, just because it's Q2 GDP is great doesn't mean it's going to be great a year from now. And initial claims, right? They came in pretty low. But this is what I said for a long time, right? Until initial claims hit around 300K, it would probably be premature to call a recession. And so they're still around 231,000, so still relatively low. I could see a scenario where you get a recession scare before the end of the year, and then the market bounces, and then maybe in 2026 or later 2025, the recession finally arrives if we're going to get one. But yeah, I mean, it takes a long time for this stuff to play out. At what price do you think miners capitulate? I mean, honestly, some miners have already been selling. I mean, I've seen some things about that recently. I think a lot of them. I think miners have been selling already. Um, so yeah, I don't really think there's a specific price. I mean, I think they do what they need to do to stay afloat. And the weaker miners will sell at a loss just to try to keep things going. The stronger ones might try to hold on, but it's not a specific price. With the time left until November, December, do you still see all Bitcoin pairs going to 0.25? I still think they're more likely to than not. Last cycle, they didn't really make this move. Okay, they didn't really make this move until just before rate cuts. So I would say there's still a strong possibility that they do come back down here by the end of the year. I think it's likely. It's now a good time to DCA gold for someone with virtually no allocation. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's okay to DCA. I mean, I am on the record several months ago saying gold would go to 2,500 and then get a pullback. So if you are going to get in, it could make sense to sort of DCA, and then if there is a larger pullback, to then really scale that DCA up. I mean, long term, I don't really think it's going to matter, but even in pretty scary situations like 2008, you can see gold was moving up, and then it had a pretty big pullback, but then it recovered a lot quicker than the stock market and kept on putting in new all-time highs. So yeah, I mean, I would say if you're going to do it, I would DCA in. I don't think in 3 years you're going to care if it's 2,500 or 2,000 or 2,300, but that's my view. Would crypto recover faster than equities following a hard landing, or would the recovery take roughly the same amount of time? I think crypto would probably recover quicker, because I think crypto is more so tied to liquidity, and if there's a recession, I think they would just try to flood liquidity back in, so I think crypto would react quicker. Where is the liquidity going to come from to get Bitcoin dominance to top? Which alts need to bleed, ETH and SOL? Well, ETH has already done a lot of the bleeding. I think SOL is going to do some of the bleeding from here. I think there's a compelling case to be made that SOL Bitcoin is sort of doing the same thing that ETH Bitcoin did, where essentially you have, a 90% drop followed by a 500% rally, right? That's ETH Bitcoin. And then in that 500% rally, ETH Bitcoin entered into this distribution phase up here where you have sort of 4 peaks. And then if you look at SOL Bitcoin, you'll see the same thing, generally speaking, right? It was about a 90% drop, and then it rallied on up about 500%. And it looks a lot like ETH Bitcoin, where it's kind of doing that 4 peak thing, right? Where it's putting in, sort of 4 peaks. And I think it's probably going to go back this way before we know it. And that should contribute to the Bitcoin dominance. Yeah. How to look at smaller cap Bitcoin pairs. Trading view sometimes bugs and shows the y-axis is 0. I don't look at small random market cap coins. Like I don't follow those, and this channel doesn't talk about those, so I'm not gonna be able to help you there. If it's showing the y-axis is 0, then maybe try a different exchange. DDCA strategy video for USD ETH Bitcoin be super helpful. The time is nearing. I mean, I think it's whatever risk tolerance you're comfortable with, right? It's not trying to time the bottom, right? It's just whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah, let's be careful about just randomly mentioning a lot of random alts that I've never even heard of. Yeah, I don't know. This one's not showing up on here, so I don't know. Someone with money to invest in stocks, want to invest in Americoin and Tesla. Do you think it's best to DCA or lump sum after rate cuts in case we get a discount in the markets? Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say. Like with Mara, what happened last cycle is it sold off into rate cuts and it bottomed on the last rate cut. Now, of course, you only know when the last rate cut is in hindsight unless it's literally at like zero, right? Um, my suggestion is to, could be to have like a sort of a get a small position around rate cuts, but I wouldn't go all in because there is still a chance that the unemployment rate continues to go up and we get a hard landing, right? So I wouldn't think it would make sense to just go all in on random, on some of those random tickers in the hopes that you time the bottom, because there are chances that it doesn't. I mean, if you look at like Coinbase, I mean, it has retrace back to this trend line. So yeah, look, I mean, it looks like it bounced, but sometimes once it tests this trend line often enough, eventually it will break. And when it does, it can get a pretty big move to the downside. Dollar General was one that we actually saw just today do that. And the only reason I was looking at this one is because some of you guys had previously asked about it. The longer it'll test these trend lines, eventually it'll just break. And when it breaks, it'll get a really big drop. Okay. So I wouldn't go all in because, imagine if you did that with Dollar General last week at 109, you're all in, and then now you're down 20, 30%. You got to be careful with individual stocks. Going all in for the index is less risky than individual stocks because the index has proven over and over and over again to eventually go to new all-time highs, where individual stocks may or may not. Generally would like to understand if dominance comes down next year, why would you limit your ethanol allocation only 20 to 30%? Why not more? Is there a scenario where Bitcoin dominance still trends up? There's always a scenario where dominance trends up, but it's a good question. But the reason is because 20 to 30%, that's just my own risk tolerance. For someone who hasn't been in crypto as long, maybe they want to raise it up to like 40% or something. The other thing is that just because Bitcoin dominance goes down doesn't mean that the altcoins you buy are going to do well. So imagine if you were to put all your Bitcoin into altcoins because you think Bitcoin dominance is going to top, and maybe you're right and dominance does top. But what if you put all your money into altcoins that just go down? You know, you know how like in Bitcoin dominance uptrends, there are alts that outperform Bitcoin. In Bitcoin dominance downtrends, there are alts that underperform Bitcoin even during a Bitcoin dominance downtrend. So that's the thing, right? You have to be careful, because imagine if, say, 2 cycles ago, you had said, all right, maybe you want to put your money in Dash. And then you look at it a few years later and you're like, well, it really never stopped going down against Bitcoin. Was there, really, since 2017, has there ever been a time where it would have made sense to convert your Bitcoin to Dash? Not really, right? I mean, it just keeps on bleeding. And that's my concern, is that, just because dominance tops doesn't mean every altcoin will. In fact, overlay Bitcoin dominance onto the Dash chart. You can see here, dominance was going down. I mean, really, dominance was going down throughout this entire phase over here, but Dash Bitcoin was also going down. So just because dominance is topping doesn't, or whenever it does, right, it doesn't mean that all altcoins are going to outperform it. Do I have a backup way to communicate if Telegram is shut down? I mean, we have YouTube. I'm sure we would figure out something if we had to. Might just go to email. I don't know. We have a someone from the future in the chat. They say, come from the future and ETH Bitcoin bottoms in Q4. All right, that's good to know. I do think you're probably right. There is a chance that it could bottom before then, but even if it does bottom before then, it would probably put in like a double bottom or a slightly higher low in Q4. But yeah, I mean, it could be Q4. The reason why it could be earlier than Q4 is because the last 2 times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, it only took 2 months to bottom, right? So like, for instance, here, after it finally had a monthly candle below the range low, it bottomed the following month. And then over here, after it had a monthly candle below the range low, it bottomed 2 months later. So it seems like we might be finally about to have a monthly close below the range low. So there's a chance it just bottoms in September of 2024, kind of like how it bottomed in September of 2019. right? So yeah, I mean, you could be right. It could be Q4, but there's also a chance it could happen as early as September. Do you have any plans to expand ITC's focus to include fundamental analysis for individual stocks, comprehensive portfolio strategies, and encompass everything from individual stocks to ETFs? We have talked a little bit about index funds and that sort of stuff, and I've spoken a little bit about some of the ETFs. Eventually, yes, I would like. I mean, honestly, eventually, I want ITC to be what you guys want it to be. That is what I would prefer. But there's a lot that we're trying to do in the meantime. Um, I have thought about expanding more into stocks, but I think the hard part for me with stocks is that I wholeheartedly believe that the best strategy is just putting your money into a low expense ratio index fund and forgetting about it. Like that is what I think is the best strategy. So to spend a lot of time stock picking just seems like it would go against what I think is the best strategy, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, I can do that, and occasionally I mention some stocks to you guys, but at the end of the day, I mean, index funds have been proven to be really hard to beat. For that follow the S&P. And there's a reason why most hedge funds don't outperform the S&P, and I'm not smarter than most hedge funds, you know. So is the $5 MATIC this cycle too moonish? I don't even know how high MATIC went last cycle. $3. I don't know. I mean, it kind of depends on how much damage the Fed has done. If if the economy avoids a recession or it's only a mild recession, then yeah, I mean, anything's possible. I wouldn't go into it thinking that's going to happen, but yeah, I mean, anything's possible. Since the market is boring, what have been your favorite vacation spots? Um, I went to Hilton Head for the first time not too long ago, and I really liked that. Do you have a target for the bull run for Matic Bitcoin and XRP Bitcoin? So for Matic Bitcoin, there is a chance that it's already bottomed. What I'm looking at is this. I want to know, is it a bleeder or is it an oscillator? And so if it's an oscillator, I would expect it to do something like the white line up here, sort of just bounce around in this range for a few months. If it's a bleeder, I would expect it to just keep breaking the range lows and then maybe get a pathetic little bounce in 2025 and then keep going down. I don't know yet. If you want to take a risk, I mean, 700 sats is pretty low, but at the same time, a lot of people would have said the same thing at 2,000 sats. Now, fortunately, I was not one of them. I said very clearly, I think it's going to go down to at least 800 sats, and it did. Right, and it turns out I was too conservative. It actually went down to 670. XRP Bitcoin is kind of tricky. It has gone down here near these historic lows. And I guess the question is it just kind of repeating this phase? Or is it just kind of doing this where then it still then bleeds back down all the way down here, right? And there is a chance that that happens, especially if all Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows of 0.25. You're going to want to see some of those higher market cap alts not do so well so that it actually pulls those alt Bitcoin pairs down collectively. So, if it's just doing like this, which it could be, we've made a lot of comparisons to 2016 in the past, and you can see that XRP Bitcoin basically had a similar run where it bottomed out in June of 2016, June of 2024, and then it rallied and then topped in September, right? And so I wouldn't be that surprised if going into the end of the year, you see XRP Bitcoin even come back down into that range. It's possible. But after going there, it should get a bounce, I would assume. When to take profits on all, which indicators to use. So I would generally look at the risk metric. So we have a risk metric for the altcoin market. It's called AMC, right? This is the altcoin market cap risk metric. So I would use this, or you could use the risk metric for individual alts as well. But they're not going to be as accurate because a lot of them just haven't been around long enough. Total monthly Fibonacci candles of compared to 2019, there were 4 red candles and we are currently at 2. So if it repeats to the downside until November, perhaps elections and inverted yield curve results. Yeah, I kind of think like there's a good case to be made that this market just kind of keeps trending down into the end of the year and then potentially reverses course in 2025. I think it's a good way to think about it. There's also a chance the market goes up in Q4, kind of like 2023. But if the 2019 comparison does play out, then the expectation would be that, it still is a little bit too premature. Can the risk metric be applied to the spot ETFs for Bitcoin and ETH? I mean, it's basically the same thing, right? If hard landing materializes, I'm thinking of using lump sum strategy. Anything I should be cautious about other than not knowing where the bottom will be? Yeah, I mean, no one's going to know. So, I mean, if you do lump sum, you could still break it up over the course of a month and just be like, 4 buckets of it or something. It's hard to say. I mean, like, if you were to look at like the S&P in 2008, right? Lump sum generally works, but there are times where, like, if you lump sum everything here in 2000, then you're essentially waiting 13 years for it to durably break new all-time highs, right? So, yeah, I mean, the data supports lump summing into stocks, into index funds is better than DCA. I have a hard time. I mean, generally that's true. I just stick to the risk level, given the fact that it seems like the yield curve is about to uninvert. That might be kind of risky, but look, I don't know. I don't know how long it'll go up before it gets a deeper correction. Remember, in 2019, the S&P went up while Bitcoin went down. Think it's fair to say that after a 30% rate cut from 5.5, Bitcoin can eventually bottom or change trend, assuming there's no hard landing. Yeah. DXY up for 2024, down for 2025. Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, the dollar has actually gone lower than I thought it was going to go this August, but I do wonder if it will just sort of bottom out here and then bounce into Q4 and then down into 2025. Seems like hard landing has a greater chance than soft landing. Fair to say. The data supports that. It doesn't mean you can't have a soft landing, but like there were 2 soft landings in the last like 50 years, right? Or 100 years, right? 1967 and 1995, but all the others were hard landings, I think. On the new formula, unemployment rate, interest rate, would it be best to enter the market when it comes back down to earth? So you have to be careful with that metric because, like, if you look at it, the market doesn't always bottom when it hits this trend line, right? So if you look at the S&P and you line it up, right? So when it collapsed here, yes, it corresponded to the bottom. When it collapsed here, yes, it was the bottom. When it collapsed here, it was a little before the bottom, right? You can see it fell back down, but then the market still went down. Yes, when it was down here, that was where the bottom was, but it didn't go down there the first time that it hit the bottom. Over here, you can see that it's not actually true, right? We had a recession, but the recession from 1990 ended before it bled all the way back down to the bottom, right? So in 1982, it was basically the bottom, and in 1975, it was close to the bottom. But again, there are examples where it bottoms out before this metric gets to the bottom. Most of the time, it does not. And of course, this metric could change really quickly, right? I mean, because you're dividing by the unemployment rate squared. So like if the unemployment rate were to really start to go up and you're dividing by, like, say, instead of 4 squared, dividing by 16, you're dividing by, say, 5 squared, 25, that can make a big difference because you're multiplying by the inflation rate. If that comes down, that'll bring this down. And of course, if inflation's going down at the same time that interest rates are going down, at the same time that the S&P is going down and the unemployment rate's going up, then this thing can go down to 0 pretty quickly, or close to 0 pretty quickly. Last cycle, you said you didn't do so well selling into the second peak. I assume, yes, it's true. I sold well into the first peak, but not the second one. I assume because the risk levels were lower than the second peak. with the second peak. How should we correct for this scenario in the future? Well, first of all, there's no we, but I will say I think the thing to use is the social risk. So that was something that we developed afterwards, right? After seeing that. So if you go over to the website and you go to the social risk, you will see that in the back half of 2021, the social risk went back up to the 0.91 risk band. So I think that is hopefully how to compensate for that. Can you elaborate more on your stance regarding Bitcoin dominance topping and Bitcoin price action leading into the year, beginning of next year? Yeah, so I think dominance is going to top sometime between September to December. That's my guess. I think that if and when it does top, if it tops in September, then USD valuations of alts can still go down through December. If Bitcoin tops in December, then that might actually be when alt USD pairs bottom as well. So that's it depends on which path it takes. Generally speaking, though, alt USD valuations are still going to be struggling, I think, for at least a few more weeks till September, through the end of September at the very least. There does exist a scenario actually where in September the market is green, kind of like how it was in 2016 and 2019. So, but if that happens, then there is a strong likelihood that you could see them bleed into Q4. Yeah, glad you get to ask your question. Are you still the opinion that crypto finds a short-term bottom and rallies into the Fed meeting? It's possible. I mean, it's certainly possible. It's not like I have a super strong conviction on this stuff, right? I mean, I generally think that all Bitcoin pairs are going to bleed. It is possible that ETH, you know, gets a nice move up, but I think that there is a chance that whenever ETH does get that move, it could be after ETH Bitcoin bottoms, whenever that is. So whether it starts early September, late September, October, I don't know. I don't know. Is likely to outperform Bitcoin during that short period against USD. Are you talking about ETH? Yeah. So I think that whenever ETH does go back up to its bull marks, it'll probably outperform Bitcoin during that time. Um, but again, I don't know exactly when that's going to occur. I just see there's a lot of reasons to slowly pivot your view about ETH Bitcoin. I think ETH Bitcoin could still go a little bit lower, but I think it's much closer to the bottom than it is the top. How do we use the best data DCA chart? Can you go over a basic DCA strategy? Yeah, so like if you go over to the best data DCA, what you want to look for is the lowest bar here. So like if you pick Bitcoin, the best data DCA, it tells you Monday, and it's because Bitcoin on average is lower on Mondays than any other day of the week. Hold on a second, give me like 1 second. All right, sorry guys, I had to had to take that. It was a phone call I had to take. All right. So yeah, so going back to this, how do we use the best data DCA chart? So basically, if you look at it, it'll just tell you what day, on average, is Bitcoin's price the lowest, and on average, it's the lowest on Monday. So if you're gonna DCA on a regular basis, and you pick a day, Monday, like and again, this is based on UTC time. So, but like Sunday night, Monday morning tends to be the best time, basically. If you switch it over to like Ethereum, you'll see something different, right? Ethereum, it's Friday, and it's actually been Friday for a long time. I remember doing videos on this a long time ago, and um, yeah, it was also Friday, because I remember it was for Bitcoin, it was Monday or Sunday night after the close, and then for Ethereum, it was Friday. What time frame would this around this when? Sorry, what is your time frame around this, and would that impact a bull run mania for alts? Oh, you're talking about ETH? I mean, my guess is that ETH Bitcoin goes up next year. I don't know what you're asking, honestly, but that's what I think. After Bitcoin goes to minimum 0.7, 0.8 risk, it has eventually retraced to 0.1, 0.2 risk. Is it fair to say that it can happen again? In 2013, when it didn't happen, Bitcoin retraced 75% from wick and 6% from close. Yes, it's possible. And I mean, I've been warning about that for a long time. It's hard. I don't want to warn about it every single day, because, then you're just sort of labeled a doomer. But that stuff is possible, right? I mean, and it could happen. If you were to look at Bitcoin USD, this is one of those things where, like, it's not been wrong to be cautious. It's just that it's a long process for this stuff to play out. Been Bitcoin heavy for 2 years now because the multiples on alts are so unattractive. Do you think we'll have the chance for several 5x or more with alts in the coming months after rate cuts? I think it's possible. Yeah, I would really like to see alts take that haircut against Bitcoin, get down alt Bitcoin pairs to 0.25. I think that would make it a lot easier. But for me right now, I still think that there's reason to be concerned about altcoins. Not all of them. I mean, I do think some of them already have bottomed against Bitcoin, but for the most part, I think a lot of them still could go further down. Remember, last cycle they didn't bottom until QE started, right? I mean, if you go look at alt Bitcoin pairs, and you overlay total assets held by the Federal Reserve, I mean, you can see pretty clearly they bottomed when the Fed went from QT to QE, and that hasn't happened yet, right? Like, that hasn't happened. So that's why I still think it makes sense to be bearish in all Bitcoin pairs. Thoughts on COTI Bitcoin? I guess I've looked at it before. So it looks like it's also trying to hold this as support here. No guarantee that it does. And just like all Bitcoin pairs, it might be the bull mark support band that pushes it down. I would say if it can get above the bull mark support band, hold it as support, then there's a decent chance it's bottomed. But again, this is one of those charts where you sort of you set a low, and then you come back down and revisit that low, and then eventually it could very well just break and keep going down. And there's a lot of alts that follow that pattern, right? I mean, I pointed out Dash Bitcoin earlier was one of them, and even AVAX Bitcoin is probably going to follow that pattern as well, right? Where it sets a low early on, and then it comes back down to that low, and then eventually it comes back down and then just keeps on going. Is there any chance the guy from Coin Bureau can interview DJ Panic? Let's have some fun. I don't remember what fun is like. Best to hedge now, I guess. You could always be hedged. What are your thoughts on time and risk bands specifically for this cycle compared to all cycles and data when looking at 0.1, 0.2 risk? Is this cycle a deviation? It could be. There's also seems to be some like drift, I think, in it where it just slowly goes higher. But I also think that there is a chance that let me actually just pull it up so I know what you're talking about rather than just ramble on about something I don't even know. Time in risk bands. So looking at this cycle, you can see that it's really hasn't spent that much time at the lower risk bands. Last cycle, it did. Cycle before that, it did, right? I mean, it could be one of those things where we go there and we spend some time there later this year or early next year, right? That's always a possibility. We've already gone to the point 0.7 to point 0.8 wristband relatively early in the cycle. Normally, that's reserved for sort of late halving year, early or post or in the post halving year. So it's possible. What is the recommended cash allocation if your base case of ETH going home happens toward the end of the year, which probably corresponds to a lot of alts going down in the USD price as well? I look, that's got to be up to you. I don't have a recommended cash allocation. It depends on what your risk tolerance is. I mean, if you think ETH is going to go home, then obviously you want to take advantage of that, right? There are chances where it doesn't go home because I would have said the same thing a year ago and it still didn't. And, it's been one of those things where it has felt so convincing for so long that that's what it's going to do, and then it just keeps not doing it. I think that perhaps this time it might actually do it because this time ETH Bitcoin has broken down, right? And these times over here, after it broke down, that's when it finally went home. So I just wonder now that ETH Bitcoin broke down right there, just like it did right here, and just like it did right here, perhaps now ETH USD can finally go home. As far as the amount of cash to have in case that happens, that's up to you. Is the base case for ETH Bitcoin to bottom by end of the year? Yeah, I think so. And would it outperform Bitcoin in 2025? I think so. Is it a good idea to be in an ETH heavy portfolio, 70% in 2025? No, I don't think so because there's no guarantee. Bitcoin is still, I think, where you would want to have the majority of your portfolio. That doesn't mean that if you do go ETH heavy, you could, it doesn't mean you'll be wrong. You could be right, right? It's just you're taking on a lot of risk. It's further out on the risk curve, right? If you go look at modern portfolio theory with Bitcoin and ETH, you're essentially saying you're going to take on more risk. Now, a lot of people have been doing that for the last 3 years, a lot of ETH maxis, and they've been taking on more risk in hopes of getting more reward, and they've actually been getting a lower reward because ETH Bitcoin has been bleeding. If you're going to try to time it, probably 2025 is the best time to try it, but there's still a chance that ETH doesn't outperform Bitcoin, even though my base case is that it will. Would you make Ethereum faster or cheaper to use? I mean, I'm not making anything. FOMC assessments of appropriate monetary policy dot plot. Given the distribution of the dots, it's reasonable to estimate that the rate could fall around 3.85% between mid 2025 and late 2025. Yeah, it could. I think my base case on the Fed funds rate is going to be between 3 to 4% for next year. How much of a profile is appropriate to trade for ETH at these risk level or at these levels? The plan is DDCA until the end of the year. How much profile? Are you talking about your portfolio? I don't really understand the question, guys. How much could we see ETH outperform Bitcoin next year? I think ETH Bitcoin could go easily back up to 0.06, maybe like 0.07, somewhere in that area next year. Assuming we actually get back to looser monetary policy. When holding ETH, what do you think of staking and restaking ETH? I mean, basically, with a lot of these proof of stake things, if you're not staking, then you're being diluted, right? Because if everyone else is staking, you're not, right? I mean, you're being diluted. So, I mean, it seems like a wise thing to do, but there are risks involved, right? There's slashing. You could theoretically lose ETH. So again, it kind of depends on the risk you're willing to take on. Fair to say, gotta wait 6 months after rate cuts at the minimum to see if it's a soft landing or a hard landing. Also thoughts on terminal price target realistic. Yeah, no, I mean for sure. You can't really declare a hard landing or a soft landing until after we're done with rate hikes and after we've had rate cuts for a while. You really only gonna be able to look back on it in a few years and then fully see the whole picture, right? I mean, it's hard to see it when you're in it. You can zoom out many years later and then it's obvious. Is it a good strategy to be 100% out of Bitcoin right now and buy only when it stabilizes above the bull market? I mean, you could do that if you want. Just be aware that if it does follow, the prior halving years in Q4, you might miss out. But if you're okay with just getting back in, as long as it holds a 20-week SMA, and you're okay missing the percent move between now and then I think it's fine if that's what you want to do. There's certainly a chance we see Bitcoin just get rejected off of it and go down. If it follows 2019, the earliest Bitcoin would reverse course is September. But if it follows 2019 as it relates to rate cuts, the earliest it would turn around would be, December. When holding ETH, what do you think of? You already asked that. Could you please explain how risk bands work for some of the altcoins with regards to their ETH and Bitcoin risk levels? The issue is that we don't have a ton of data. So if you're looking at them and you're confused, we just don't have a lot of data for them. And so you really need several cycles of data for them to make sense. If you're looking at them and they're at zero, it's basically because they just keep on bleeding on their Bitcoin pairs and they just haven't bled like this for this long in prior cycles. And so it's just sort of normalizing what is, and that's the hard thing, right? I mean, like, if you were to pull up like those charts I was looking at earlier, Dash Bitcoin, what does even low risk mean if it just keeps on bleeding forever, right? Some alts can bleed forever, even if they're at low risk. Is it mandatory for MATIC to hold 700 sats for it to do well this cycle? Not necessarily. Um, there was an example last cycle where ADA dropped into, and was still going down even after rate cuts, and it bottomed out a month after, or right around a little bit after the first rate cut, about a month after the first rate cut. So there does exist a scenario where Matic Bitcoin could go down just a bit more, and then bottom out down here at like 500 to 600 sats, hold that, and then go up. There is a case where something like that could happen. If an alt hasn't bottomed before ETH Bitcoin and continues bleeding after ETH Bitcoin is bottomed, would that imply it's a rally? Probably, because I mean ETH Bitcoin is the hardest one to turn around because it's the one, highest by market cap. So if the alt can't turn around after ETH Bitcoin has, and I don't know when it's going to, and last cycle alt Bitcoin pairs, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them bottomed out in August, um, a month before ETH Bitcoin did. Can Link put on a new all-time high in 2025? I mean, these questions are hard because, like, the answer has to be yes, right? Like, yes, like, any asset can put a new all-time highs in 2025. Like, it's possible for that to be, like, I would say yes to basically anything, right? To say no would be to say that, the markets can't go up, which, I mean, it's possible they could, and if they do, and they turn the money printers back on, then yeah, I mean, alts could go to new all-time highs. So yeah, it's possible. In the next cycle, where do you see Bitcoin dominance topping out? 45%? Oh, no, I mean, I think it would go a lot higher than that. Probably like, I don't know. I mean, if you look at dominance so far, I mean, yes, it's true that it's been putting in lower highs, but it's also been putting in higher lows. So there's no guarantee that what if it just kind of bounces around in this range? Sort of goes up to 60, then down, and then back up, right? I mean, maybe it tops out at like 55, 57. I don't know. Would you please share some guidelines on how to balance or how to build a balanced portfolio allocation using ITC Premium features? So, one thing you could do is you could go over to the weighted risk page, and then put in some coins. And by doing it like this, you can see what your weighted risk is of your portfolio, right? And so, for instance, if you're in an altcoin and the altcoin you're holding is at like 0.9 risk, then your weighted risk of your portfolio would be very, very high if you're majority there. So it could be a good way to say, like imagine Solana is at 0.9 risk, then that could be a good reason to, like, get rid of that one, and then to, maybe put it into something else and get your overall weighted risk down. So maybe this is the tool that you could look at. I would also say looking at just the DCA strategy tool, and just kind of getting an idea of how the portfolios look based on what you've DCA'd, and that. So these are the two main tools that I would use. And you can see kind of buying different amounts at different risk levels for different assets. Does Bitcoin dominance always lead the charge in every cycle before topping out to alts to take over? Generally speaking, yes. That's how it works. That's why Bitcoin usually puts in new all-time highs first. Can we have some optimistic, moderate, worst case Bitcoin conversion targets for other alts? So how I did for ETH, yeah, I already said for ETH. The issue for other alts is that, the worst case is just they go asymptotically to zero against Bitcoin, right? But I would say, if you're looking at sort of the sole Bitcoin pair and thinking about it in terms of ETH Bitcoin, I would say it could come back down here to like 14,000, 15,000 sats or so, and then bounce. I wouldn't be that surprised to see something like that. So I would say keep an eye on that level. Would be what I would be looking for Sol Bitcoin. For Link Bitcoin, it still just keeps on tagging this trend line. So best case is that that's the low, right? Worst case is that it goes asymptotically to zero against Bitcoin. If it does get a big drop, then I think you just look at all Bitcoin pairs, realize they need to drop about 30% to go to 0.25. So if Link Bitcoin were to drop another 35%, that would put it around 1100 sats or so. If Mara followed the 2019 drop in rate cuts, how low could it go? Well, I think you have to annoy. I think you have to avoid the pandemic drop, right? Let's just pretend like that didn't happen. But if you ignore that and you say, well, rate cuts, sort of came in right here, kind of like how Mara is at that same sort of level, then Mara ended up dropping about 60% after that. So I mean, if it were to drop 60% from there, that could put it as low as $6. Again, it doesn't have to go there, right? But if Bitcoin were to drop, it could. I think it makes sense to have some exposure, but if it does drop, to take advantage of that because it probably would go up again, especially later on in 2025. Ignoring USD valuations, does Link remain a good project in your eyes? It's going to depend on what it does with, with its Bitcoin valuation. I haven't seen it put in a durable low there yet, so that's what I'm looking at. If we see a ETH USD back to the regression band, what would that mean with the majority of alts getting decimated? Yeah, I think a lot of alts would go to new lows if ETH were at its regression band because they already are. I mean, they're already almost there. So there's just not a way. I mean, look at DOT. It's at $4, right? I mean, the low is 350 or so. So you can't really get a big correction by ETH and not see altcoins go down, in a commensurate way. So it would put them at new lows. Percent chance that MATIC Bitcoin is bottomed? I don't know, maybe about 50. And if it hasn't put on a new low by the end of September, I'd probably say 60. And I would just increase it by 10% every month for the rest of the year, assuming it doesn't put in new lows. Can you explain in detail why you think gold is going to see a big drop soon? Look, I'm not saying that's a tradable thing, right? Like I have exposure to gold and I'm not like selling my gold in preparation for a big drop. I said when it was at 2000, it would rally to 2,500 and then get a pullback. I think the rationale for it could be that if you get an uninverted yield curve, you could get a pullback by gold, right? It's possible that something like that could happen. One of the reasons, maybe initial claims keep coming in low and real GDP keeps coming in hot, and the markets realize that liquidity is not coming back as quick as they think it is. That could be a reason. What do I do to relax? I don't know. I mean, sometimes I play sports. Sometimes I play disc golf, tennis. I play chess, hang out with the family, all that stuff. What do you think the diminishing risk level at the prior two cycles and the implications on this cycle? Yeah, I mean, it probably means that we'll have diminishing returns again. And this is kind of an argument that, crypto Twitter gets into every single cycle. But essentially, if you look at the ROI from the low, sorry, that's ETH. Yeah, there's diminishing returns, which means that it's likely not going to give you the returns that Bitcoin got last cycle. If there's a hard landing, when will we know? After it happens, right? I mean, probably after it happens. If the unemployment rate continues to go parabolic, then the probability of a hard landing goes up. Someone says that their crypto portfolio is 25% Bitcoin, 75% cash, looking to deploy 75%, about 25% ETH, 25% alts, and 25% meme coins. Is this too degenerate legit wealth creation strategy? I'm gonna stay away from the meme coins because I just think they're scams. I can't with a clear conscience really talk about those. As far as the other stuff, I think it's a fair thing to do. Especially if the market, especially if the altcoin market unwinds into the end of the year. Any thoughts on TLT? Yeah, I mean, I've talked about it before. I think that, as I said before, I think the 80s were the time to hedge. That was when I got some TLT, was down here in the 80s. I think you could get it to come back down, worst case, but it's already bottomed. If it hasn't bottomed, it's probably just a double bottom in the short term. You could argue that what if it's doing this kind of thing? Same kind of trend, right? It's possible, but if it's going to happen, you're going to need a lot more hot economic data, and then you would see the 10-year yield go back up, and maybe it will into October because that's when it tops the last 2 years, right? Into October 2022 and then October of 2023. What were you dubiously speculating in the last public video? I was just going through various Bitcoin paths, basically. Do you think the unemployment rate is skewed based on the influx of immigrants? Not really. You showed Bitcoin or sold Bitcoin could drop. Is that because of prior support? Yeah. It's also because that's kind of what ETH Bitcoin did. Like it got a big drop, but it didn't go all the way back down to the lows. It then came back up and then slowly bled back down. What would the 2019 been be doing this with this phase of the cycle? All in on no, I mean I wouldn't be all in. I'd still be like 60, 70% Bitcoin, but I would have some alts, right? Is there a possibility the unemployment rate accelerates? The Fed cuts by 200 basis points and we see stocks and crypto turn around quickly while the actual economy slowly melts down and then another market crash. Yeah. In fact, I mean, you could easily see a situation where the stock market and the crypto market sort of unravel into Q4. The Fed prints, markets go up in 2025, but because the Fed prints too soon, inflation comes back in 2026, and then you get another meltdown. When are you going on vacation again? I don't have any plans right now. If ADA Bitcoin gets 400 sats, what USD risk level could ADA get to? I mean, if ADA goes to 400 sats, then it's probably at new lows on its USD pair. I don't know exactly, but maybe between 10 to 20 cents, worst case. Continuing on the Bitcoin dominance dropping next year question, instead of being Bitcoin heavy, why not ETH heavy? Same thing as I said earlier, right? There's no way to know, right? There's always a chance that ETH's just a bleeder and it had just a good cycle, right? I mean, that's my argument. But again, if you're going to be ETH heavy, then the post-halving year is the year to do it, right? I mean, just because I'm not going to do it doesn't mean you shouldn't. If you're going to be ETH heavy, then the post-halving year is probably the year that it actually makes sense, or at least it has the highest likelihood of being a strategy that you look back on in a year and being like, oh, that actually worked out. Had you done it the last 3 years, I think it would have been a terrible strategy, and I think history has shown that. But if you do it in the post-halving year, it probably has the highest chance of working out. Some risk metrics, confidence levels are low. Is there a different metric I should use to guide DDCA? Yeah, I would just use the altcoin risk metric. Do we need one more lower low to match the 2019 into 2020 period? It could be another double. It could be like a double bottom. If it's a hard landing, if you want to talk about sort of the resolution to it all, yeah, like it would be. I would require, first of all, if it double bottoms, we haven't had that low yet. Sort of that sweep of the prior low. We haven't had that yet. If you get a hard landing, then obviously that's still off in the distance. Can I please take a look at Zcash? Okay, so it has had a bit of a move recently. I think I'd prefer to look at it on its Bitcoin pair. I think that'll probably make a little bit more sense to look at. So, I mean, it looks like it's broken through here. You can see, though, in 2021, it did the same thing. I think the issue with this one is that it looks like just like a macro bleeder, right? I mean, even in 2021, it never really went that far up. And this is another example of like, just because Bitcoin dominance goes down in 2021 doesn't mean that all the alts are going to do well. So I don't know. I mean, I don't really look at this chart and get excited about it. Yes, it's possible that it's getting a little bit of a move here, but it's done that before and it's still just ultimately resolved to lower levels. So I wouldn't get that excited about that chart. Someone says they're thinking about hedging into Mara by transferring 10 to 20% of their Bitcoin stack. As better for tax purposes, and I think higher upside than Bitcoin. I think you're right that Mara has more upside than Bitcoin, but it also has more downside. So I think it's just a more volatile version of Bitcoin. Okay. So that is what I think you should think about. If you're okay with that, then fine. Because remember, when you look at when rate cuts arrived last cycle and you ignore the hard landing, or you just ignore the hard landing, Bitcoin from when rate cuts began in late July, Bitcoin fell about 35%. But from when rate cuts began in late July for Mara, it dropped around 59%. So, yes, it's true that it could theoretically work out, but as rate cuts arrive, there's a chance that Mara underperforms Bitcoin. How can we judge newer altcoins on their Bitcoin pair if there isn't enough history? Yeah, I mean that's why newer altcoins tend to do better than older altcoins because they don't have the baggage, right? So you judge them based on, the founder, who's the founder, the fundamentals, that sort of stuff. Thoughts about dynamic squared DCA strategy where you dynamic periodically no matter what, or you DCA periodically no matter what, but the amount you buy is based on whatever the risk level is at. Yeah, no, for sure. And I've talked about that before. There's some people that buy up to, you know, even 0.9 risk. It's the same thing. Yeah, I think probably more people do that than you think. What made you state ETH Bitcoin falling below 0.04? Basically, it was if it follows 2019, which there's no guarantee that it does, right? It's just that in 2019, ETH Bitcoin sort of had this collapse right here, right? You see that wick, and that wick was the first week of August, the week of August 5th. Same thing over here, the week of August 5th, and then it had a green week and then a slight red week, kind of like right here, and then the third week had a weekly wick below that prior wick, and then the following week it then bottomed out as it went into that final area. So that's the reason why. Why would a larger correction happen after 6% dominance? It's because like when the blue chips fall, if they do, then it basically is implying that all that liquidity's run out from the altcoin market. That liquidity's dried up. There's no longer that liquidity there. Therefore, you know, once you pull that liquidity from Bitcoin, then Bitcoin gets correction until the Fed pivots sufficiently. Thoughts on NVIDIA earnings and impact on markets? I think you're getting a little bit of profit compression. So or margin, right? Profit margin compression. So I think that is kind of spooking the markets a little bit right now because, you know, that's the first time it's decreased since Q2 of 2022. So I think that's why we're seeing some jitters right now. Could also be we're just going into some unfavorable seasonality in September. If the economy is actually better than people think and higher rates aren't hurting the economy, it's possible. But with the unemployment rate moving up non-linearly, I have to imagine that you know, the economy is slowing down. It's just slowly, right? When will I start getting into alts? I mean, I don't know, probably later this year, but I wouldn't wait on me. Is there a roadmap for the app? We don't have anything right now. We are doing stuff, but I don't think we have a roadmap published. If we get a recession for longer than anticipated, say until the second half of 2025, do you think it's possible for Bitcoin to peak to change structure timing? It's possible, but if it doesn't happen next year, then my guess is that 2026 would just be a bad year too. Thoughts on using USD rather than Bitcoin for buying ETH? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You don't have to trade your Bitcoin for ETH if you don't want to. Is 10 trillion market cap realistic? Probably. I mean, if it went to 3 trillion last cycle, I don't see why not. But again, you know, if you have a recession, it could delay things. But I do think it will eventually get there. Could you elaborate your equation with the unemployment rate squared? So basically, I was just looking at it because I'm like, well, what if you look at this stuff divided by the unemployment rate? And I was like, oh, well, it looks like it changes the S&P. And I was like, what if we punish it more and we square it? I was like, oh, it looks really similar to all these other cycles. And then I thought, well, you know, what happens if you do the same thing for Bitcoin? And actually, I don't think I showed you guys this. It actually looks really interesting. If you look at it for Bitcoin, I mean, you can see, look at that trend on Bitcoin. I mean, you can see that the downtrend is a lot clearer for Bitcoin when you account for the unemployment rate. So yeah, I mean, it was just random. It wasn't like, you know, some genius idea. It was just some random thought. Like, oh, we talk about the unemployment rate, we talk about interest rates, we talk about inflation. What happens if we make Bitcoin or the S&P a function of that stuff? Which alts would you recommend trading for Bitcoin when the alt season starts? Anything holding its lows or turning up on its Bitcoin pair? All right, guys, that's it. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Bye.